I'm in the business of wanting to resurrect that triumphant beast in you.
Welcome to The Boundless Body, the podcast with a somatic doctor interviewing innovative thinkers about their perspectives relating to the arts and sciences of therapy. Discover The Boundless Body.
Back to the mystery.
Okay, I want to welcome Samantha Sweetwater to the show. Welcome, Samantha.
Thank you.
Yeah, so welcome to The Boundless Body. Really looking forward to this chat.
Me too.
It's been, I think my estimation is 22 years since we've seen each other.
Many rivers, many bridges. Yes.
As is the ritual in this podcast and many podcasts, is to read out your bio first before we plunge into the matrix of thought. Samantha Sweetwater is a Gaian futurist, ceremonial guide, and soul mentor caring for people and the earth at the intersection of personal transformation and civilization transition. For over 30 years, you just said 35 years, she has facilitated evolutionary experiences in diverse communities, cultures, and industries on 5 continents. She teaches a systematic and embodied approach to deconstructing separation, healing trauma, and reawakening to nature, the body, and the soul. Through this, she helps her clients and students remember wholeness, revitalize kinship, and activate regenerative leadership on behalf of all life. Her first book, True Human, Reimagining Ourselves at the End of Our World, will be available spring 2025. You're just finishing up the text now, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
As am I. So there's an interesting convergence there. I'm finishing this Visionary Somatics book this week. It's due by December 1st. So like... I'm dreaming sentences and citations and
Huge.
Yeah, I was writing the first pieces of it about 4 years ago, and so much water has gone under the bridge since then that I feel like a different person. So it's almost like encountering somebody different when
absolutely.
Yeah.
The process transforms you. It's wonderful.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I often like to start the chat with kind of a story of personal initiation, which can be transpersonal. But often us healer types, we have to go through an initiatory illness, a difficult time in your life, which ends up catapulting us into the wombs and tombs of healing and being a healer and holding spaces and containers for other people. So do you have a story like that?
Oh, gee, yes. I do. More than a few, actually. The most formative event of my development as a healer, thinker, human committed to being really human was a 2-year sequence of events through my Saturn return from 28 to end of 29, where I fell in love with an extraordinary yogi who I was extremely resistant to. He was very aloof, but courted me very heavily, and fell in love with this very handsome man, Ayurvedic practitioner and dancer. And we had this extraordinary relationship that we were the center, the hub of a very tight community of healers and spiritual practitioners. And there was a beauty and intensity and tantric communion in that relationship. Then about a year into the relationship, he just decided that the relationship had never happened and left.
Oh,
this never happens. I was completely heartbroken and felt like I was going crazy, because it was like, did I make this up? And in hindsight, when I've gone back to all the love letters and such, I did not make it up. It was a real thing. And in reality, he was narcissistic, avoidant, not integrated yogic type of human being, someone who had really sought refuge from humanness in transcendence.
The Boundless Body podcast is brought to you by BiTap, the creators of a powerful bilateral stimulation tool for nervous system regulation. I use this tapping technology clinically because it's a wonderful, gentle, pulsatile, tactile stimulation that helps the brain to regulate experience. And what I mean by regulate experience is not just managing the bad stuff, but amplifying the good stuff. So these tappers aren't just used clinically, they're used in many different settings, including with frontline workers, people that have test anxiety, kids and parents, teachers and school counselors, people in addiction recovery, restless sleepers, and people that are struggling with pain management and medical issues. So the benefits are vast. You can go to the BiTap website to get your tappers to help with your nervous system, and you can enter the Brian10 code to get your discount. I hope you enjoy the show.
About a year later, he called me up, having been traveling around Canada, and said, I'm looking for a place to land. Do you have a place for me? I'd really love to come and meditate and do my work in your house. And I had a little spare room that was my healing room. And I said, yes, you can come and live with me. And over the course of about 2 months, he meditated himself into a psychotic break. And that psychotic break manifested as a violent break. There was an event that happened that I was afraid he was going to kill me. We ended up corralling him, and I ended up taking care of him in a dissociative state for about 10 days. That was it had a lot of different manifestations, but some of them were very, very, very deep karmic memories. So there was a lot of things that happened during that time, including him almost convincing me to kill him with a knife that his father had given him. Is a wild experience, and me burying the knife. And ultimately, it ended in him walking across the Golden Gate Bridge and then walking across open traffic, taken into the psychiatric ward at SF General. And that ultimately led to his parents coming and getting him, and a whole journey for him. Meanwhile, in my world, my community collapsed around it because people felt like we shouldn't let this Kundalini crisis go to waste, and shouldn't let him go into a Western medical paradigm. And a lot of that responsibility came down on me. And I didn't get a lot of resource or support for that. Additionally, our spiritual community really rejected being available. We were students of Baba Hari Das, and that community completely failed to show up with any kind of care or guidance. And so that was like kind of an ultimate slap in the face for me about like the shadows of the yogic paradigm and of the enlightened paradigm in general, which is, depending on how you construct it, it's a story that says that we can solve the problem of humanity by coming into union again with consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And I got a radical initiation into how unintegrated developmental trauma cannot be meditated away. How, and it was just like, you can't trump or trick the human experience. And that whole experience for me grounded me into this. I say a lot in my teachings, incarnation is non-accidental and non-arbitrary. And I think that the place of the human in the soul ecology, or the ecology of consciousness that is the Gaian process that we're embedded in, is an extraordinary and exquisite thing. The place of an actual human being who is willing to be human is actually the sacred thing we're here to be. We're not here to be gurus or Buddhas or beings without identity. We're here to really rock this thing called humanness, which of course includes those Eastern tools. But I have a pretty radical view on that being an incorrect direction for our development. And I would say that was when I was 30 and I'm 52. So it's been a 20-year integration cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, that integration cycle really completed itself in 2019.
Wow.
And the kind of teachings are moving forward, coming out of that.
Wow.
My soma is healed from the trauma.
Yeah.
And they've done a lot of work to integrate those learnings. In Ken Wilber's Integral Enlightenment is a somewhat helpful frame, but I think it fundamentally still lacks what a lot of some indigenous traditions hold, which is this kind of like awe of the place of the human within the larger creation.
Yeah. Wilber poo-poos magical reality as a kind of childish developmental stage that we need to grow up from. And that actually mimics Jung's thinking about it.
Yeah. Which Hillman critiqued like so radically.
Ah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is why I never studied psychotherapy, because I agreed with Hillman in my 20s, in my teens, actually. My 20th year was the year Hillman wrote, "We've had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world's worse." Yeah. And I was like, yeah, actually, I think you're right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Hillman, what a brilliant mind. What a brilliant mind. He just stood up against the whole kind of psychoanalytic tradition, the Jungian tradition, and just he was an iconoclast, a kind of code stripper or identity stripper. And was able to hold up this mirror and just be like, it's more complicated than that. It's more magical.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had a wonderful, wonderful integral teacher named Will Tagle, Dr. Will Tagle, whose framing on integral was that higher integral is mostly purple, which is the animist layer of Claire Graves' spiral dynamics. And I think he's completely correct.
Mr. Tagle. Tagle, did I say right? What a tickle. What a tickle.
Tickle Tagle.
Tickle Tagle. Did Tagle tickle you or tickle you with his thinking? Tickling Tagle.
Oh,
what a tickle.
He was so amazing. He and his wife, Judith, were Texans who were very foundational to the founding of the discipline of psychotherapy and who had created a program called Eco-Shamanic Trauma Mentoring. That's what I did my master's in. And they were getting quite old and they didn't end up having the energy to really found it as a discipline. He was a great soul. I could feel his presence as a large, large presence with many ancestors walking with him.
Eco-Shamanic Trauma
Mentoring.
What? Mentoring.
Eco-Shamanic Trauma Mentoring, with the insight that to walk with someone in a journey of healing is to walk with their souls as a mentor rather than as a healer, or mentoring being the role of the companion in a lot of ways.
Yeah, there's something closer to the earth and cosmos about that. It's a humble image of mentoring and togetherness. I appreciate that image as opposed to the hierarchical image that is just such a catchment basin for humanity, right? Where you have the kind of shaman at the top, and then the novices below that can sometimes take them 15, 20, 30 years or never to kind of crawl up the hierarchical ladder of power, where you have, it's like the shadow side of the initiation archetype, where the novice can stay a novice forever under the kind of subjugating power trip of the lead shaman or whoever it is at the top.
Yeah.
Is characteristic of that catchment basin is the humorlessness.
Yes.
I'm imagining that this yogi guy, like at least in his belief about what was his transcendent belief about what he was doing and what he was up to, was utterly humorless.
Yeah. Yeah, very serious. He had a great sense of humor when he was being funny. But in
Yeah.
that space, no sense of humor. The argument we had over and over and over again was actually about this like kind of dialectic between, are we here to have joy and be human and delight in the experience? Or are we here to focalize consciousness so that we can be in that pinyin of yoga chitta vritti nirvana, which translates as yoga is the cessation of the thought forms in the mind.
Yeah. And it's kind of like it's a centering process in the kind of axis mundi of the body, the sashamna, but it can be a capturing center, a rigidifying center, a center that squelches human connection and humor and the things that are the delight of the fruiting bodies of the earth.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And this is one of the reasons why I love Hillman too, because he really was a decentering force, an eccentric force.
Mm-hmm.
There's that dialectic of centering and decentering. If it's all about centering, you're missing half the picture, at least.
And all the vibrant adaptive diversity that happens at the edges, that's a law of ecology. Surf the edges if you want to actually touch the things that are most adaptive.
I love that Hillman was foundational for you. One of the things I love about him is how he talks about color symbolism. And he talks about in transcendent methodologies, centering methodologies, transcendent thinking, that you often have this, what I like to call toxic innocence or unconscious innocence, a hidden grandiosity claim, a hidden God claim that is fundamentally whitewashed. This is the symbolism. This is the color symbolism portion.
Yes.
White is equated with innocence and purity.
Yes.
And what Hillman says is like, you can live in that space forever. It's not the real transformation that the earth does, because what happens after when you just milk curdles into yellow, what you have is, what the ancient alchemists called the rotting process, the putrefactio or something like that. I'm not good at Latin, but putrefaction.
Yes.
Mortification, the white curdles and turns yellow, and there's a seed of rot inside of all of white. The toxic innocence wants to just hold on to the innocence and then project the shadow onto others, but then resists and denies and displaces that seed of gut rot. But then what happens in the end is things like, hit this guy's story, a seed of rot in his whiteness, that took down the whole scaffolding of his psyche,
Absolutely. Well, and that story is replicated over and over and over again in spiritual communities, in communities that are oriented around love. I did an interview with one of my mentors a number of months ago, and he asked me at the end of the interview with Dr. Jim Garrison, and he said, "What about love, Samantha?" And I said, I think love is really overrated as a goal for what we're doing. Give me the deep, rich ways in which we can interact reciprocally, and let's learn about that and struggle with it together. And that's meaningful to me. But love as a pinnacle, it so quickly gains that shadow of whiteness, false purity.
In couples therapy, I like to remind couples that the Western romantic ideal is profoundly whitewashed. It's got this sense of kind of like, okay, if you find the right partner, and this converges with this idea of the twin flame that's propagated like crazy now, and is just it's just crazy. I was possessed by that in my 20s, sometime around the time that we met. Where's my twin flame? I found her.
Yes.
And Western civilization is often caught in this fantasy that we need to find the one, and the one is like the perfect love, the innocent love, the pure love that's going to just be going on in perpetuity.
Mm-hmm.
But every couple, if it wants to become mature, needs to move through rot. Just, I mean, like the seasons, hello, right? Through, the rotting of power struggle. The couples writers talk about this all the time. Like, where are you at? Are you in the power struggle phase? Good. If you're in the power struggle phase, good. That means you're starting to come out of the romantic ideal and you have a chance of really being human together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
To establish actual intimacy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Love. Love. Yeah. It's such a interesting thing, right? The spiritual bypass, we could call it, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
Love bypass or something. Purity bypass.
Mm-hmm.
The bypass of whiteness. Yeah.
It's interesting to try to construct a language that is all the colors.
Yeah.
And the darkness, and what happens when you flip it and construct the whole model from the rich darkness.
Yeah. That's why I love Donna Haraway. You ever read any Haraway? The Staying with the Trouble, this book?
Yes.
Making Kin in the Thulacine?
Yes.
That's badass.
Yes.
I love that. She's just got such a way of making kin with the darkness, making kin with what she calls the tentacular ones, right? Like we have these tentacles. It's not just, squid or octopi or whatever. We have tentacles. And those tentacles are going off into the world, and elements of that probing and propagating activity are often in the darkness of the unconscious, right? That these probes, that these tentacles go off into the world and they're unconscious opinions, they propagate identities, they kind of go out into the world and try to make clones of ourselves as superior identities and so on. And a lot of that stuff operates in the darkness and the shadows. And if we can make that more conscious, it's just like, oh yeah, we all got these tentacles, like we propagate identities. That's what we do. Humans do that.
Yes. Yeah. And I think additionally, in the way that I think about the masculine and feminine, there's a 4-quadrant model that I like to work from that's inspired by Jung and Garrett, but it's a little bit different. But it's in that model, the Shiva is the quiescent masculine and the Shakti is the active feminine, and the Yin is the quiescent feminine and the Yang is the active masculine. And we live in a hyper Yang civilization. We give power and value and clout and status to that structured masculine over and over again. In that map, the quiescent feminine is the rich, absorptive space where dreams and grief and generational cycles of assimilating trauma happen. I find it hard to fit the frame of the unconscious quite onto that yin, that absorptive dimension, because when we call it the unconscious, I always feel like there's a value judgment on something that implicitly needs darkness to do what it does, and that's radiant and has consciousness, like has super consciousness in it. So I think that's an interesting one to bring forward. I don't feel like my thinking about that is complete yet, but it's something like I chew on a lot, because in my own soul seeing through Iboga, I'm very dark, but that is not equated to unconsciousness in the way that my own soul has been shown to me. It's equated with vitality and power, that placing it in the unconscious makes no sense to me.
Yeah, I love where you're going with that, Samantha. I want to chew with you. Maybe it can be, this is a weird image, just spontaneous. There's like pelicans, right? Isn't there like pelicans that kind of do this thing where where the mom kind of chews and like kind of spit and then swallows and spits it out?
I don't know if I want to do that.
Okay, it's a bit intimate.
I'll side by side with you, cow style, and chew this cut.
All right, we could do it in an individuated space, but maybe we can hold the image in front of us as something that nature does, right?
Yes.
Nature does crazy shit. It rots, it destroys. In embryology, programmed cell death, for example, is just as important as the shaping of tissues. It shapes tissues. Programmed cell death is essential to the production of a life form.
Yes.
There's a sense with the kind of understanding of the unconscious or the teachings about the unconscious that they're at their foundation paranoid. At their foundation paranoid, that the unconscious is out to get us, that we have to kind of do this heroic moving of what is unconscious into consciousness. And then there's like this hierarchy of who's conscious and who's got the names and the frames, to kind of be the hero on top, I suppose, of making the unconscious conscious. But there's fundamentally a paranoia there.
Yeah, where it's like the soil is dark and it carries infinite intelligences, that like in 1 inch of soil is as much computational intelligence as in a brain of an equivalent size, and the soil is unconcerned with its own darkness and continues to manifest great intelligence. And like, that's kind of where I sit with that vital darkness, where there's a vital darkness in me that is unconcerned with its own darkness and is exquisitely intelligent. It's like more equivalent to soil than it is to that kind of hierarchical map of paranoid unconscious shadowy material, where I'm like, actually there's a whole lot of me that is really super conscious that also doesn't need to surface in the form of story, but it's the gravitas that flows through a being. That's another version of vital darkness that I just see. The dark feminine is obscured completely by the narrative of the unconscious.
Yeah, or it gets represented, represented as a Jungian archetype, for example, and once consciousness represents something, there's a distancing dynamic. As soon as we say something about something else, I had an old teacher that once said, as soon as you name it being divinity, whatever version of divinity it is, then you have a holy war.
Right.
As you represent it. And once it's represented, there's a distancing, and there can be these superiority claims that trickle down, or trickle probably isn't the best word there, but.
Yeah, that's a fascinating truth that I struggle with actually quite mightily. Like, how can we go beyond those dialectics in a way that is truly elevating of the song of life?
Yeah. So, I mean, you've already mentioned the soil. How can we soil ourselves? Because we're already soiled. We don't have to work on it. It's in our guts, right? Like in our microbiome. That soil is in our guts. And, the great biologist, visionary biologist, Margulis, she's just extraordinary, right? So she's the one that talked about endosymbiosis, and, like everybody, all the dudes in the field were trying to discredit her. Now it's an accepted fact of evolution, where you have all this interpenetrating identities. And she actually called it, with her son, she called it bacterial omnisexuality. Bacterial omnisexuality is happening in our guts right now, where you have horizontal gene transfers and all sorts of pairings of identities and chimeras, and viruses and bacteria and gobbling each other up and spitting and chewing each other up and combining. And this is what life does.
This is what life does. Well, and to me, the possibility of transcending holy wars lives there. And it lives in restoring our attention to the way all of this actually operates, rather than creating continuous iterations of new stories about it. There's a way in which the end of holy wars may live in cracked open intimacy with and objective observation of and intersubjective singing with the way all of this actually works, which is this vastly entangled, symbiotic, constantly symbiotic dance between things. And that to me is the possible Aikido move that is like, let's flow with all those versions of divinity and say yes. And like, what made it possible to embody that? What made it possible to cognize that? All of that narrative, that perception of divinity that is made possible by your gut microbiome.
For sure. Trillions of identities just doing the omnisexual thing. And in so many creation mythologies on planet Earth, a lion's share of them, I believe, were ancestral deities, omnisexual deities, where you have brother-sister pairings and,
yes,
mother,
yes,
son and father, son, and people spitting mud into, somebody
yes.
else, and mud coming up from the kind of bottom of the ocean and creating a world out of that, and stuff, growing out of shit to create an entire new world.
The kind of master deity in the Aztec society that this statue is at the center of the anthropological museum in Mexico City. I never got the name right. It's one of those incredible Mayan double X. Like,
yeah.
This deity is it has a kind of feminine head, and then it's birthing babies, and then it's eating the babies. And it's like so intense. And I came to this deity and I was like, exactly. That's the most accurate rendition of God I've ever seen. Like, God got us like it's just the eating and dying and the birthing and like all at once. It's so cool. And it's so like hideous and that it's totally exquisite. I really want to carve one and have my own.
Yeah. Wow. And it's so cool. It's interesting that you can't articulate the name. And I think there's something beautiful about not knowing the name in a way, but also carrying the reverence. Because clearly you have a reverence for this unnamed entity that's there, in a museum. I have this fantasy that someday, all of the kind of trapped creatures or the trapped totems in the museums will one day break free, and then it'll just kind of walk into the scene or something like that, and bring us a little bit more towards freedom. But I wanted to zoom in a little bit, or zoom out, or both, on a distinction that you've made. You've said the word transcendence. Now, but before we clicked record, you used the word hyper transcendence. So I'm wondering if we can play around a little bit with the distinction between transcendence and hyper transcendence.
Can we expand the frame?
We can do whatever.
Awesome.
Whatever. I'm game. Let's yeah.
So there's a really basic couplet that wants to come in before making that distinction. The basic couplet that is incredibly meaningful here is the transcendence immanence dance.
Yeah,
for sure.
For sure. I'm so glad you brought that in, because if we're trapped in just transcendence, we're screwed. So good.
Yeah.
Yeah. Say more about that, this dialectic between transcendent and immanent.
Immanence means in the world. So immanence is a word that arises out of a Judeo-Christian context where there is an inquiry as to whether there is divinity in the world. So that the word immanence spelled Immanence. There's immanent is timely and now, and immanent is here and in the world. It's fascinating to me that all these words are so close together. So immanent refers to the inquiry, could it be that God is also in the world? So one could hypothesize that prior to the use of the word immanent, there was no word for something that was a given. That the body was holy, that nature was holy, that the springs were holy, that the trees were holy, that divinity flowed through everything, that the world was sacred, that the body was an erotic vehicle for pleasure and prayer and praise and grief. We can hypothesize there's a lot of cases where something that is so obvious to a culture as the world being sacred actually lacks language because it's an a priori cultural context that everyone assumes. So the word immanence itself arose out of a cultural context where divinity had been pushed out of the world. And then there was a need to explore, could it be that there is immanence of divinity, that the thing that is nature has holiness in it? Yeah, so that whole context on the language is important because it arises out of the context of axial divinity, which is a very recent cultural evolution. As Josh Schrey says, animism is normative consciousness. The vast majority of our evolutionary time as a species on this planet, we did not inhabit it within the construct of axial gods. We inhabited it more primarily, and we don't know all the ways in which humanity has constructed religiosity and divinity over our 200,000 years of history, but we can assume that the majority of our time was primarily oriented towards some kind of animism where there was divinity in the world, in immanence. But the word itself points to bringing it back once we've taken it out. But if you own it fully, you could just own that there is divinity in the world. There is divinity in the gut microbiome. There is divinity in this tentacular, interpenetrated, entangled process of the co-construction of reality. Transcendence orients towards, there's different ways to construct transcendence, but transcendence points up always. There's an innate construction of hierarchy in the concept of transcendence that points to the more refined being better, but also kind of places a judgment on the thing that is not being refined, which is a fascinating frame that permeates everything we've talked about already around darkness being holy, soil being intelligent.
So the core question driving this podcast, or like a refrain or a chorus in a song or something, is what can a body do? What can a body do? I love it because it's complex and simple at the same time. It also comes from Spinoza, the great philosopher of immanence, who Deleuze took in kind of a radically trippy and complex direction. But Deleuze is a philosopher of immanence. He's an embodied philosopher, a somatic dude, and a trippy one at that. Most definitely a philosopher of immanence. He talks a lot about magic. And it's interesting that he codes magic in and plays on words and making up words and neologisms and also hyperliteracy as well. But I think he's like a magician. His question, what can a body do, that comes from Spinoza, relates to the question of magic. That's there in his text. It's the stuff that kind of gets overlooked by other philosophers that want to be more structural about his work and ontological and so on. But it's there, beating at the heart of his work is the Hermetic tradition, the magical tradition, the animist, tradition, which fundamentally has to do with magic and the question of magic. And it's not the magic that's like, pulling a rabbit out of a hat or something like that, or magical thinking where I can just kind of like will a big diamond to to suddenly appear on the top of your head or something, somewhere near the third eye of the lion or something. It's the type of magic that the universe and biology does.
Yeah.
Because that's the actual pulling of the actual rabbit out of the hat. It's the actual pulling of something out of nothing.
At the heart of what I experience transcendence to be is pure presence. So magic to me arises when truly refined attention is brought to the immanent. This one of the constructions of mysticism generally is the as above, so below, as within, so without. And that requires like extraordinarily rigorous attention.
Refined attention.
The beauty of yogic practice is the refinement of attention towards what is in the Vedas is called viveka kyati, which is discriminating wisdom, which is the ability to bring that, like the purity of consciousness to attend to whatever is there to be attended to, whether that's consciousness itself or the opportunity of creation. In that sense, magic can be extremely mundane. You could water a plant and the seed could sprout because you attended to the seed.
Yeah.
Appropriately.
The magic of the mundane, I love. It's a good juxtaposition. I was reflecting about languages populated by binaries. It's like we can't escape them. We do our best, I suppose, to creatively use them. But, because I was thinking when you're using images of purity and refined attention, the danger of using some of these binaries like transcendence, refinement, purity, is that, again, we're back into this kind of a place to arrive at or something that people can then lay claims to and then subjugate other people with. You and I were calling it the identity virus earlier. What do you think the identity virus has to do with binaries?
I mean, certainly we get very identified with moving in the direction of purity, moving in the direction of being a being of love, being a being of light. I like to think of Buckminster Fuller said, I seem to be a verb. I think that the antidote is to orient oneself more towards the qualities of action that we engage in.
Yeah, that's interesting, because then it's like, as opposed to transcendence or arrived or refined or purified, we have refining, transcending, purifying, verbing, ising, communicating, connecting, inging,
enjoying,
attending, ripping, which is what, biology does too. It rips.
Yeah.
It deconstructs, deconstructing. Hillman was good at that, right? Just deconstructing. But then there's also a sense that, the deconstructionists, like, can just kind of.
It's interesting though, my own felt sense of that is that in terms of identity, when I feel into this one here that's having this conversation with you, the verbing for me is not a verbal verbing. Like, it doesn't require that I name it as a.
That's the trick. God. Yeah, I totally agree, because again, once you represent it with a word, then there can be this distancing element. So back to this thing where, as soon as you name it, you have a holy war, because then once you name it, it can be problematic. And it's so weird in this kind of, I call it the identity wars. We're living in the era of the identity wars.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the key, in my experience, the more I live in the felt sense of living, at the core of all of that is living. centering that allows the namings to be less lighter.
Yes. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the namings of curious, or I'm thinking of it in terms of emotional intelligence, but also in terms of identity of woman or somatic expert, or,
Yeah.
you know,
Well, by golly, Samantha, you're doing non-dualism. I'm being facetious and a bit wild here because, it's interesting how much dualism can find its way into something that identifies as being non-dual.
yeah. I mean, I think of it as whole self. The way I talk about it in my work is and it's trinitized. Trinities are very helpful if we want to transcend holy wars. I think of the operation of self as a synthesis of what I call no self. So the Eastern traditions would call this true, capital T, capital S, true self. But I think of that as a no self. I think of it as consciousness that's at the center of me, at the center of you. I also experience it when I gaze with a lion. I don't think it's a human only property of there being consciousness at the center of selfhood. And then the second dimension of whole self is soul self, is the specificity that I am, the specificity that you are. To ascertain the nature of soul is a different kind of attending than attending to no self. I could get into that in a detailed way, but there is a nounness to soul, usually reflected obliquely, either by nature or plant medicine or a mirror, one's own work to attend to the suchness and specificity of one's own soul stream.
There's a nounness. You're putting a crown on the noun?
No, but there is no self is, and soul self has suchness. So suchness has specificity and form.
Yeah. Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the deepest, I'm a student of Mahamudra, which is the Tibetan Buddhist frame on the Great Seal in consciousness, which is a union of awareness with awareness.
Mahamudra Ing.
Mahamudra Ing.
Mahamudra Ing.
And when I'm in that practice, I think of that as a practice of decontextualization of no self. Whereas attending to the soul is a practice of contextualization, of specificity and uniqueness. And this one, I'm in dialogue with you. There's a dialogic dimension to soul self. This one is learning in a collaborative process with that one over there, with you, in your unique history and specificity and fascination and attending to life, which is not the same as mine. And together we're a greater thing than either one of us. And that is uniqueness in relationship to uniqueness.
Yeah.
And then there's the human self, which includes like the work I've done on healing trauma about being in conversation with men and feeling annihilated by that in the past, and having greater capacity for calm in my nervous system to be in dialogue with you. Like that's all part of my human journey and the evolution of my healthy identity structure. And that's the way I construct humanness, human identity, human selfhood in a non-dual way. And the distinction between the no self and the soul self is really important there. And then the addition of the human self, where it's like, yeah, like identity is cool. The membrane of the ego can be evolved and transformed to better express who and what I am as a soul and as a mote of consciousness. And it's helpful if I can communicate well, regulate my nervous system, know what I want, know what I don't want, set boundaries. Owning all of that as skillfulness of the human self. Know how to plant seeds with my system, attend to the spaces I inhabit, and both socially and ecologically. That's all part of the human self in the way I construct that. This, by the way, is like a framework that I plan to spend a lot more time with over the rest of my life.
Yeah, I appreciate the paradox baked into the journey, the thought journey, and the kind of thought probes. I think I'm hearing you say, or at least the way that I'm translating it, is that to connect with nothing of a self or a no self, one can have the capacity to be every self. If I connect and strip all these layers, and I'm not that, 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 then I can kind of make this transition into kind of going, I'm that, and 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 I'm that.
That's really, I love where you took that. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes there's these gnarly presences in nature, like maggots, for example. And my body can just kind of go, just like, but then it's like, okay, if I descend down through the layers, I can find something maggoty about myself.
Yes. Or you could find the union of self in maggot and in everything else, and then you could, like, it's interesting because the aspect of maggot in self feels like a soul reflection.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing, right? If you strip it all, right? It's this it's like so many facets. Every facet. It's like the holographic element where everything is everything else and everything is rooted in nothing. And wow. I mean, what a wild ride it all is. I'd like to talk about scapegoating. The way that I'm understanding scapegoating is that it's pretty ubiquitous, especially in families. If we just think about family systems and tracing back to the origins of family therapy, we had this idea, like these visionaries like Virginia Satir and stuff like that, saying that, the scapegoat is just ubiquitous. It's there in the family as a structure, as a role, so that what the family can do to maintain its togetherness and its purity and its kind of vision for itself, innocent vision for itself, is put all their crud on the scapegoat.
Right.
And as I like to say is imagine a sexless marriage, for example, where there's not that juice flowing, in the couple. And so that repressed and unexpressed energy's got to go somewhere. So, they often end up scapegoating, and kind of judging on their daughters and sons for sexually acting out. And that's further amplified by the fact that they don't have, that they have a sexless marriage, so then they can conveniently, call their sons and daughters sluts or whatever. But really what's happening is that they're being irresponsible. And I think that this is just such a common thing that happens to maintain this false sense of purity, this false sense of superiority. I'm not the maggot. Right. That idea that you have is the maggotry. I don't do that thing. I'm not aggressive. No, I'm not aggressive. I mean, often these people that are love identified, right, are very passive aggressive. Why? because
Yes.
they need scapegoats to hold the aggression for them.
Yes. Yes. Certainly what we can't allow in ourselves, we push onto others. It's very true.
Have you seen this play out at all in the psychedelic community?
I mean, it plays out everywhere.
Yeah.
It plays out everywhere. I think in the psychedelic community, there's a real fear of there being disintegrity, of there being violation. And then someone can become the target of that perceived violation. And certainly the underground space currently is a space where it's very, very hard to figure out how to have restorative processes that don't then involve big collapses and crashes and Me Too campaigns and public takedowns and call outs. Call out culture to me is a scapegoat.
Whoa, reminds
pattern.
me of what's happening in the ecstatic dance community.
Yeah. Yeah, where it's like, let's make this person the enemy, but the only way that the restorative process could happen. It's interesting. I had a conversation about that yesterday morning in my kitchen. The restorative process that needs to happen at this point is about everything that's been triggered in the community. It's not even about the players that it's been made about anymore. I don't think.
So much splitting and othering and virtue signaling and canceling. There's a lot of ings in there that don't sound as fun as some of the other inging that we were doing before.
True. It's true. I mean, the basic process of self-responsibility and apology is when we don't have a lot of normative cultural contexts for. And I think we need them. You know, we need spaces for truth and reconciliation and apology and responsibility and ownership, but we don't have many of them.
Yeah. Like I did a restorative justice training years ago, and I also lived in New Zealand for a few years and, hung out with the Maori quite a bit. And some of those the restorative justice community has its roots in Australasia, New Zealand, Australia. I tend to think that there's some mobile genetic elements coming from the indigenous communities informing the roots of the restorative justice community, because there is this sense of a fierceness to the Maori, especially. They carry this archetypal warrior energy that if I didn't have a blueprint or a map for that, because all I had was like American football in like Minnesota, it wasn't particularly useful for me in terms of becoming a whole human. Yeah, which is it's an inging, like I'm still in the project, right? So,
it's an ing.
but I could like kind of witness and be in a haka and feel the tingling going up my spine and feel what creative aggression felt like. Creative aggression, which is distinct, of course, than destructive aggression. But in a way, I'm thinking about restorative justice as precisely that, as creative aggression. And aggression sometimes needs to be met with aggression. But the problem is that this clash of destructive aggression with destructive or punitive aggression, right?
Right.
But where's the creative aggression? Like I write in my book about Inuit singing duels, which is a form of ancient restorative justice. So you have somebody in the community that, was a freeloader or something like that, or a murderer, or somebody that was an adulterer, whatever it is. The accuser would bring the accused to the community and they would have a singing duel. And the community would then decide based on who brought the most powerful words and made everybody laugh the most, who was going to be the winner of the justice tribunal. But you see, it wasn't punitive in the sense that, after everything was over everybody would just have a potlatch and basically just have a good time. It was all in the spirit. Creative aggression in the sense of justice was made.
Yeah.
Okay. Retribution happened, but then the community comes together and bonds and has a good time after that, you know?
Yeah. And capoeira culture is like that too in Brazil, where you come together and you dance it. I mean, you duel it out, but no one is killed. It's a dance of presence in the body.
I was in the capoeira community for quite some time. When I was at Harbin Hot Springs for a few years, when I lived there, around at the time that you did, I believe, I was way into capoeira. I had those white pants. Yeah. They were very whitewashed. I was such an innocent little, I got my capoeira pants.
Yeah. Yeah. Although I feel that white is held in that culture a little bit differently than the hyperpurity.
Oh, well, I don't know. Yeah. I just know that, there's a seed of rotten in every toxic claim to innocence. Sure, I was in the community long enough, and then the maestro started fucking his students, and people started to get really upset with each other, and crossed the line in the Hoda, because it's supposed to be play, and then it toppled into kind of aggression because it kind of wasn't dealt with creatively, so it kind of came out, and then people would get aggressive and then not be accountable for it, and then I left the community.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because to maintain creative aggression as a cultural context requires a great deal of maturity on the part of both the community and leadership of the community.
Yeah.
I was part of Camisa's community, which came out of Rio, a large community in Brazil, in lots of different cities, that actually had this like extraordinary graciousness. Extraordinary.
That's awesome.
And so in that context, like the teachings of the white were very much around this like entrainment of aggressivity that requires refinement. So it's interesting because the way that the white was taught to me in that context is you're playing in the dirt. And if you want to keep your pants white, you have to be that present, which is an interesting, like, creative aggressivity requires these like refined reins. It's like a Reichian form, that aligns with divine energy that's greater than the person. And so it's interesting where like specifically the white pants in that lineage and as I've experienced it in some of the Yoruba traditions is actually like almost like a gate that helps you to organize that intensity in a way that is sufficiently refined to maintain the creativity of it. So in that sense, it's like pranayama, right? Like there's these couplets that actually have to kiss each other constantly, like to expand and restrain energy in a way that is constructive.
What does nature do? It creates and destroys. Our bodies are built in fields of destruction and creation, literally. Programmed cell death and, morphogenetic fields that build tissues. I'm thinking about the question of innocence. Like, what is real purity? What is real innocence? And the image for that for me is a child. Like my 4.5-year-old, for example, was taking a bath last night and she took the bottle of soap at some point when I was outside the room and she threw it in the hallway. It got soap all over the place. So children in their innocence and their whiteness make a mess. There's a true innocence. There's a child. There's an orphan inside. Deleuze calls the unconscious the orphan unconscious. He also says the unconscious is physics.
There's a relationship between what I think of as chosen innocence and adult vulnerability. I'm not building this construction off of the same maps that you're coming from, so they might not match up with your maps. But the way that I think of the restoration of wholeness one of the things I think about with healing is that there's a dimension of healing and holding that is a reclamation of innocence,
Mm-hmm.
of unarmoredness, and that is, available to awe, wonder, curiosity, relaxed presence. That's also deeply bound up with the restoration of trust in our choices. That part of like the rupture that many of us experience, that almost everyone experiences, also involves a sense of not trusting oneself and not trusting one's own choices, because you make choices and something terrible happens, and then you feel like you don't know how to navigate, and that there's this reclamation that happens. One aspect of that is the choice to restore innocence, to stand in chosen innocence. I choose to be guileless in some contexts. I choose to release cynicism and, hypervigilance and strategizing and actually just be undefended.
We kind of mentioned on the fly the drama being enacted in the ecstatic dance community. You were talking in your kitchen about it. I'm just wondering if we can explore, what adult vulnerability might look like in this case, and creative aggression might look in this case as a possibility, as a kind of imaginative, or as a thought experiment of us dancing with what's possible in a community that's been ruptured.
Yeah.
So there's been there was accusations. It was brought to court that the person at the top was accused of violence, and domestic abuse and things like that. And then now the community is in all this uproar, right? And it's just really, really sad and tragic. What are some possibilities for restoration? What would it look like to put some of these ideas into action?
There's a complex fork in this particular situation that I actually think is present in many, many situations in the world, which is there's a strong argument to make that the person at the top of this community has a personality disorder. Restorative justice does not work when someone is in the dark triad quadrant of psychiatric disorders. That there's a get real that has to happen at the gate, which is that can this restorative process happen in a way that we expect contrition to actually generate true change for this person? Or do we need to set a boundary somehow that has this person be taken out as the leader? And I don't have good answers for that question. And that is one of the, that's kind of an at the top level of the stack question that applies to most of the people running our world.
Yeah, like antisocial personality disorders.
Correct. Sociopathic, narcissistic, multiple personality disorder, so personality disorders, Machiavellian personality disorders. I don't want to engage a theoretical process that doesn't acknowledge that, because to try to engage in a restorative justice process with people within that personality spectrum is actually naive and can be ultimately extremely harmful to the whole community, because a process gets engaged and then isn't actually integrated by the leadership. And then you end up in a continuous kind of like Stockholm syndrome kind of situation.
Well, it reminds me of your initiation story,
right,
where you have this psychotic break, and the yoga community didn't, they were anti-psychiatric, which there's a lot of that. As a psychologist myself, I was really anti-psychiatric for quite some time. But then I realized, well, hello, sometimes it's really needed.
Yeah.
Various measures need to be taken at certain junctures and thresholds that, can't be addressed by other structural means, like restorative justice process. That's a structured process. Yoga is a structured process too. that is a particular way of addressing a situation, but that sometimes those structures just fail and you need to use other resources.
Yeah. And I think we're in a world where we're very, very confused about these things, and where the discernment about them is difficult, because we've also scapegoated people and called them narcissists and weaponized the word narcissism and done all these things, where there's now a lot of defense of people who are called narcissists because we've scapegoated people who, it goes on and on and on in the wicked mirror loops. But in this situation specifically, I think an optimal path forward would involve reckoning with the fact that regardless of what happened, the person at the top of the chain is not safe as a leader, and then where the community itself gets to involve itself in a healing process. I don't think a restorative process could happen with that person and have it be fruitful, which is sad, but it's my honest assessment. And so then who within the community, or what council within the community, could create a context to say, our community needs healing around this? And some of that requires education to draw people out of, there's been a lot of narrative on social media and in other spaces of the collective being the judge and the jury, and saying, if we establish legally an absence of guilt, then we can drop this, which is actually not working. And so there needs to be an education process that draws everyone out of the mindset of judge and jury and our current, attempting to repeat a currently illegal process within the context of community.
Repeat. Yeah. Well said.
Yeah, well, that isn't the issue. The issue is that we need to create a community where men and women feel safe.
Yeah. So if that's the honest assessment that there's a personality disorder happening, then what would be the intervention?
I mean, one possible intervention would be if there's enough strength of a council to invite the community to make a decision to say, we actually divorce you as our leader.
Yeah.
Right. And that would be very hard, because there's a lot of people who have defended that leader within the context of a Western judicial system. That made a not guilty verdict. Right. So if you use the Western judicial system and you say, well, we're going to decide if this person is guilty or innocent, we're going to sit back, we're going to let the courts decide whether this person is guilty or innocent on the basis of that legal process and that judge, and we're going to defend whatever the verdict is. Okay, so the verdict was not guilty. So now we're going to defend that this person is not guilty, when many, many nervous systems in the community know that they're tracking that something's really off and feels really unsafe. It's interesting to be talking about this on record, because I know all the parties involved, and I have my own opinion about it. And ultimately, I feel like what's going on in the community is a reflection of an awareness that there's toxic patterns going on in relationship to the safety of women in the community.
It's as above, so below. It's microcosm and macrocosm, right? So it's where I go with it is how is this a microcosm of the macrocosm?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, the level to which we're in a culture where women and people who care about women and people of color are being gaslit constantly by legal systems, by the rest of the people who are voting these people into office. I don't know what to do about this. Really.
Well, I think that arriving there, Samantha, is the place to start.
Yeah, that we're in a femicidal, patriarchal, misogynistic world where both in America and all over the planet, certainly in the Muslim world, women are being killed in prisons in Iran for expressing freedom.
I don't know what to do. That There's a place in my life, or a time in my life, where I really enjoyed the work of Gendlin, and the first, which is the focusing work, for somatic work. First step is to clear space, right? Sometimes, especially for teachers like us, it can be challenging to just be like, I don't know. I'm drawn from 30 years of inquiry, and me too. Like, I've been through my, my initiation processes and my studies, and I've been ripped apart and put back together several times. And I'm thinking about the situation that you so courageously put on the table, as a microcosm of the macrocosm. And I'm like, I'm here with you. But at least that could be a clearing of a space, as opposed to just meeting destructive aggression with destructive aggression.
Right. Right.
And this is why I love this, at least this image of an alternative, maybe the image of the alternative of like a song duel, Inuit song duel. Like, I mean, I'm not saying this is the tradition that we need to replay or appropriate.
Right. Right. But that image, which is actually I think the correct way to hold Indigenous mirroring of possibility, is like, let's hold this as an archetypal image and then ask, what could it be to have something that speaks to that possibility in our own context?
A space being cleared for a community that can hold intensity.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? A community that can hold the real intensity. And that's one of the things that I talk about and that I'm so interested in. What is our window of tolerance for intensity?
Yeah.
Before the container splits and fragments, and fragments into what? Polarizations, identities, scapegoating, all sorts of claims about this and that. But can we forge a container that really has the resilience to hold the intensity that is us?
Yeah.
These people that you mentioned that have, it's like there's a feeling in the body. And if there could be a space for this maximum intensity of, and these are wounds that trace back millennia.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
it needs a space.
Yeah.
That can't get meditated away.
No, no, it can't. It can't. And there are wounds that have gone on for millennia. There are wounds that have been, so complex. Rage and annihilation and emasculation. And the DA actually demanded that the defendant, the woman involved, not share her experience prior to the case being tried. And the whole thing would have and she followed that advice. If she'd done something different, the whole thing probably would have played differently, if not in court, then certainly in community, because at least two sides would have been told. And you can't go backwards from that. That was months ago. And, in this particular context, it's how do you pick up the pieces and create a space that is safe enough to hold that fragmentation and that intensity?
Yeah. I mean,
right?
That's the big I don't know, right? Like, That's the thing that requires imagination. And I think drawing from the rich heritage of the human imagination and ritual practices and things like that, where we can hold these technologies as presences that can support our imagination in developing resilient containers to hold these intensities, and imaginative, that have humor, that have humanity, that aren't just trying to constantly scapegoat,
They have soul. I've been spending a lot of time thinking about Nelson Mandela and the truth and reconciliation processes that were made possible by his ANC, not what the ANC became when he died, which was corrupted. I've spent a lot of time in South Africa. The ANC that was enabled by Nelson Mandela's spiritual clarity, which was a clarity of the authority of the soul.
Mm.
It was a clarity of the will of the soul. And the request to any participant in the process to stand in the dignity of soul liberation. There's a key there that I perceive in Zulu. You greet people and you say sawubona, which means I see you, and in seeing you, I bring you into being, which is an invocation of mutual soul authority, a reciprocal soul authority. It's a little different than namaste. It has a deeper like aggressivity to it, actually. It has that warrior spirit in that acknowledgement. I call your will forth through my will.
Yeah.
That gate is one of the requirements. Like, how? I keep asking myself, how is it possible to involve hundreds of thousands of people in truth and reconciliation process and they didn't get to completion, but they got a lot farther. They got pretty far in the process. What could have happened if that had continued with that level of spiritual authority and clarity? And I feel like where we're going, in the next years, and certainly in the next decades, is going to require that level of clarity, because the duress is only going to increase. The storms we're experiencing this year are just the first wave of what's going to increase in intensity. The planetary crucible is tightening, and obviously the Trump-Musk kind of takeover of America is just the first wave in that story. And we're going to need to be very clear about what we're here to care for. I agree with you about the humor in the past rituals, but there's also something emergent, which is like the calling of that ferocity in each of us to say like, yo, wait, we have to stop hanging in this fomenting toxicity. And we have to cultivate the will to ground a safe space together. That's what's showing up in this kind of ideation space, is like the calling forth of the individual and collective will to create a space that's safe enough through that will to hold that intensity.
There can be such an obsession with creating a safe space that containers become brittle.
True. I agree. Yes, right.
Brave space as opposed to safe space, or brave space in a dance partnership with safe space. Like, there's no such thing as perfect safety. If we tried to bring forward an image of perfect safety, then the container is just going to become brittle and it's not going to be safe.
Right.
So a space for fierceness, a space for intensity, a space for transmutation. When you mentioned Mandela, I was thinking about this genius book by Jonathan Lear called Radical Hope. Radical Hope is a book about Chief Meniku of the Crow Nation during colonization. And he contrasts in that book the response to colonization in the Crow Nation as opposed to the Lakota response. And Meniku in the Crow Nation did, as a visionary, as a soul leader, as a flexible man, was he transmuted the entire image of the Crow Nation into the image of the chickadee. So here you have an identity that was around, who knows for how long, millennia maybe, of the crow. The entire tribal identity was around the crow. And what this man had the capacity to do was shape shift the entire tradition into a chickadee. And spiritual leadership.
At the core, one of the ways to read Mandela's leadership was lion-hearted leadership, was the leadership of lion shamanism, which equates human beings to lions. To having all four paws on the earth and attuned and entrained instinctively with the eco fields and in the lion's context, all the other organisms are the social field. In our context, that's other humans and the other organisms, all four paws on the ground, instinctively attuned to the world we occupy, and then intuitively attuned to the higher potential of the field. All of that married in the open heart.
I'm feeling into being in the guts of the lion. Inside this magnificent creature is a microbiome, and stuff is combining and breaking down and ripping apart and building and doing omnisexual pairings and so on. In the guts of the beast, we are as well.
Yeah, with an opportunity to restore the covenant that we have with creation.
Well, I'd love to, at least there's this problem that has been articulated in this particular community, and we brought theory to it, and we brought feeling to it, and we've looked at the larger macrocosm that this microcosm is within, and still I yearn for, what can these bodies do?
They can dance together.
Fucking A. Fucking A. Right?
Right.
Then the irony that the dance also is a nonverbal space. But what about the bodies that are feeling these intensities? And what about if we didn't need to have the text and language, that those intensities could come out in the space and, really be the fierceness and the intensity that is real?
It's interesting. As having said that, I'm seeing a whole dance ritual of enabling those energies. A lot of people don't know that I founded Dancing Freedom. A lot of people don't know, who'll be listening to this, don't know that my whole background is in transformational movement and conscious dance, and that I built a whole global form called Dancing Freedom that I took all over the world. That's not a frontal part of my public identity these days. So it's interesting that you're bringing this up, because there's alchemy in this conversation in terms of, is this asking for my leadership? How could I be useful here? A very active conversation. Thank you.
When I lived at Heartwood Institute before I moved to Harbin, I was on the hill, and all I had was these old VHS tapes from Gabrielle Roth.
Huh.
Every day I woke up at 5 and I just did my thing alone with Gabrielle, and that was my training in dance or whatever. I'm a dancer at my core.
Mm-hmm.
Everything I do is about the dance. So I'm feeling the alchemy, and I'm just really honored that you brought your courage and yourself and your humor and your fierceness and your imagination and yourself to this
Lovely conversation. Thank you.
Boundless body.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you got your book coming out. Anything else you want to say about that or about your work to our crew, our listening crew?
Well, I'm very focused on what kind of people we need to be to cause a next stage of civilization. I side with John Trudell in the perspective as that civilization as we know it has been the most brutalizing force ever on the planet. And that I'm not a burn it all down person, but I do think that we need to radically evolve the foundational operating system of civilization, which also orients towards how we think about self and world. So if people are interested in that conversation, I'm a person to engage with. The book is called True Human: Reimagining Ourselves at the End of Our World. And it's about the intersection between personal transformation and civilization transition. Another way to say that is it's about becoming a neo-indigenous people and a neo-indigenous society. And it's about the ceremony that we're in, which I think of as a really liminal, very difficult, has never been done before on this Gaia. I think of Gaia as a pattern in the universe where there's multiple Gaias I have a teacher from another Gaia where they transcended technological adolescence without breaking life. And so the inquiry is, how could we transcend technological adolescence without breaking life? And I see that as a ceremony for a small planet. And so this conversation you and I have just had, Brian, about the dance community specifically is really like, wow, what a nuts and boltsy, boots on the ground kind of opportunity to explore what ceremonies could support us to move through this little box canyon in time that's going to get increasingly turbulent socially, technologically, and certainly ecologically, and certainly psychosomatically, because our bodies are bodies of earth. That's how people can engage with me. The book will be out in the spring. And there's an ebook on my website. If you go to samanthasweetwater.com, you can download kind of the central offering from Sophia, from this teacher from another planet, about what we are and who we are.
Well, Samantha, it's really been an honor. You know, I was talking to my lovely producer, Drew, about the tingle response because I think it is fundamental to human transformation, the tingle response, goosebumps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I said, you know, we haven't broken the 4 tingle barrier in an interview yet on the Boundless Body, where I have felt the tingle response more than 4 times. Today I felt it 6. And I just had the 7th. 7. We broke the 4 barrier.
That's awesome.
Awesome, Samantha. Thank you so much.
I have to share you one more thing.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
So this question, what can bodies do? What do bodies do?
What can a body do?
What can a body do? Enlightenment in the true human frame. A body can hold a soul. So
yeah,
perhaps there's a future conversation there for you and I to have. That's just a little. Yeah. Thank you.
Yay. Well, thank you, Samantha. I hope to talk to you again sometime, and blessings on your good work in the world.
Thank you. And you. Bless your publishing and your book.
Thank you. Likewise.
Thank you for listening to The Boundless Body with the Somatic Doctor. Please leave a comment, subscribe, and like us on social media.
We're a swarm. We're a colony. We're a multiplicity.
Until next time, be well.